Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Chevonne Sutter. Welcome, Chevonne.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, awesome. So glad you could be here. Today's going to be a cool chat. We're going to be talking all about deafblindness today, which is an area that I don't think a lot of people know about. And I think a lot of people are curious about. Some folks kind of run into cases every now and then, but you know, we'll get into some stats later, I'm sure. But it's somewhat of a rare thing, so not everyone runs into it. I know in my experience, you know, in sort of working in 20 years, I ran into 2 clients in that period that were deafblind, and both were so incredibly different from one another. So you know, it's really, you know, folks who've been listening to this podcast for a while know that I talk a lot about bias, and you could certainly have a lot of biases about a diagnostic label, and you know, the individuals are so different from sort of person to person. So, yeah, really interested to kind of get into this and learn more about it. Also, thought it was really cool because, you know, I don't see a lot of behavior analysts working in this area. So it's fun when we find someone doing some novel stuff, and hopefully maybe getting some other folks kind of interested in doing that. Just want to briefly acknowledge that I'm producing this podcast on the territory of the Tla'amin, Comox, Homolko, and Cla'ahus First Nations, which were one community before settlers came and separated them all into reserves and did lots of nasty things. And particularly grateful for a lot of things in terms of you know, what I've been learning about the Tla'amin people. And I recently came upon, which I'll share in the show notes. I've been talking quite a few times. I do these territorial acknowledgements at the beginning of every podcast, just because I you know, I just want to kind of share, you know, what's happening in my neck of the woods, and you know, with the First Peoples that are here. And I came upon a newsletter called I don't know if I'm butchering the name. It's called Ne Motul. That's kind of what it says. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's basically the Tla'amin newsletter that comes out every month. And there's a fella named Colin Osmond, who's a Ph.D. student from the University of Saskatchewan, which I want to reach out to because he's been doing little history lessons about Tla'amin. I had no idea that there was even information out there. And so this has sort of been my latest project, is trying to learn more about the history of the Tla'amin peoples. And I hope to share what I've learned in future acknowledgements. So once again, just grateful to be here. So Chevonne, before we kind of get into the whole deaf-blind area, maybe you can just share a bit about kind of your origin story, how you got into the field of ABA, and kind of what led you to where you are now.
So let's see. I didn't actually intend originally to go into the field of ABA. And when I actually went back to grad school, I didn't even know what it was. And I was actually studying for a master's degree in severe disabilities. And my advisor was who I actually work with now in the field of deafblindness at the university, is she's a behavior analyst. And at the time, again, I didn't know that. I was studying severe disabilities, but I took this class where she was, of course, behavior analytic in nature. And she focused on instructional methods and systematic instruction and response prompting. And I had never heard of it. And the fact that I had never heard of it before, to me, it was like this, it was very enlightening. I was like, what do you mean nobody's ever told me that this existed before? Like, why haven't I been doing this the entire time? How could you not want something that was going to guide you and help you to make database decisions? And then, you know, actually tell you what about your instruction needed to change. It was just like that, one of those aha moments. And so loved working with her, and eventually after being a classroom teacher, went back to get my doctorate. And again, she was my advisor, and she was like, you should really do this behavior analysis thing. And that's actually how I started down the whole path.
Right on. So there's a bit of a story before this that I don't think we're hearing, and that's why you wanted to do a master's degree in severe disabilities. What sort of led you down that path?
Oh, well, I actually started as a classroom teacher in a general education classroom,
Nice.
and I loved teaching, but I just thought it was like a little boring, like easy, like I was working with all these learners, and in general, they're mostly really good and easy learners. And I thought, like, how can I reach these kids that have this like more complex stuff going on? Like, what is it about them and their learning and my teaching? And at the time, really, of course, I'm thinking about what is it between the individual and the environment? How are they interacting that really makes them learn? And I just thought it was such a fascinating like problem to be solved almost, or just how could we not be interested in how we learn? And so I thought, I wanted something that was a little bit more individualized to the students that I was working with. And I thought, what better way than to, look at these individuals who are traditionally, more complex learners. So that's what started me down the path, I guess.
Right. So was this degree sort of intended to just augment your teaching career?
Yeah, so I actually switched teaching positions. I went from a general education classroom to a class of students with who are more impacted by their disabilities, a self-contained type of special education classroom.
And so the master's in severe disabilities, did you actually do that degree, or did you switch to an ABA degree?
No, I actually did that degree.
Okay. And but you took some maybe like ABA courses while you were doing that? Is that kind of how that worked, or?
So not exactly. So they were actually classes in severe disabilities, but of course, for teacher education, licensure in that area. And so of course my professor was a behavior analyst. And so many of those instructional method type of courses were really ABA focused,
Right.
without using that terminology.
Gotcha. But did you do sort of the VCS or whatever?
So I went back and did all the courses, a full sequence through as part of my program as a doctoral student.
Right on. Okay, so Master's of Severe Disabilities, and then the Ph.D. Was that in ABA?
In special education, and then in addition to that, I took the course sequence, some courses through the psych department. So I had a nice mix with the final degree in special education and education.
Right on. Okay, and then how'd you go? I mean, we can already probably see a bit of a path here, but how did you get to sort of the deafblind population?
So again, this is through people. My advisor, she is actually she is the project director, and for the state deafblind project. And so originally, this was another thing that I started working as a graduate assistant at one point, just doing some extra work for the project. I didn't have any experience with children who were deafblind, but in severe disabilities, I did. And so come to find out, every state basically has one of these deafblind technical assistance projects, and there's a national center as well. I learned a little bit about the population, and it is really, like you said, you've only come across probably a couple in your career. And it's the disability that has the lowest incidence. So what we would, see as a relatively small and heterogeneous group of learners. And I thought, well, that totally fits in with this idea of, wanting to think about these complex learners and what it is that makes them learn. And that's just kind of how it started. I was like, I want to be involved in that.
Yeah. So you've mentioned this advisor several times. So who's she?
Mary Ann Demchak. She is a professor at the University of Nevada.
Nice. Right on. And so, well, let's get into some of the basics here, because, it seems sort of obvious, but in the name. But what exactly is sort of deaf blindness, and then kind of more so, like I think if I were just walking in clueless, and I saw deaf blind, the biases would kick in. Helen Keller would come to mind, as sort of the most famous person to be kind of deaf blind, and of course, it's I get the feeling she's kind of like the Dustin Hoffman Rain Man of autism, in that a lot of people just sort of, lump everybody into the Helen Keller category, not realizing there's so many differences. So maybe tell us what deaf blindness is, but then kind of a bit about sort of, the ranges and different types, that sort of thing.
So that was a good analogy, and also a good question, because yeah, you're right. It's a really heterogeneous group. We think about deaf blindness, like you said, we should typically think of somebody who is totally deaf and totally blind, and you're right. We would also probably usually think of somebody who has certain characteristics, kind of like Helen Keller, and that would be somebody who Helen Keller, in fact, was even though it was a very young age, she had some it was acquired deaf blindness. And so one of the things is that deaf blindness really includes people with a whole range or continuum of loss in both vision and hearing. So it includes those who might have a mild loss in both areas. So you might have a mild visual impairment and a mild hearing loss, but it could also include those who are completely or profoundly deaf and blind. And so it could also be, you could have a mild loss in one and a profound loss in another. It actually also includes individuals who have both congenital and acquired loss. So when we think about the characteristics of the learner, that's really important, because if those who have like a congenital loss have a very different learning history from those who have prior experience with auditory and visual stimuli in their past. And then it also includes those that have progressive loss as well. So any combination. The other important piece is that the majority of individuals, and I think the latest, we maintain like a child count type of thing, and so I think that the latest annual counts show that there are about 85% of individuals who are deafblind also have additional other disabilities. So intellectual disability might be a motor or orthopedic type of impairments, communication and language. So they're these complex learners who have more than just the deaf blindness going on.
And is that more, so congenital means born with, right? And then acquired means they kind of got it after they were born, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so is well, first off, it's okay if you don't have exact numbers. I didn't ask. We didn't talk about this beforehand, so it's okay if them in front of you. But do they tend to be more congenital than acquired, or is there sort of a balance there? How does that work?
Yeah, so a lot of it. Okay, so like you said, I don't have exact numbers, but there is there are and the actual causes or etiologies vary, but there are statistics that are publicly available on the National Center for Deafblindness if anybody's interested. But I would say that most of it is either they're born with it, or it happens during birth or near the time of birth. from some kind of a postnatal or condition or birth injury, that's also possible. There are
Right.
some like progressive conditions which are genetic, but actually lead to impairment in vision and hearing at a later age, like after adolescence. So they might have that vision and hearing when they're born, but due to the genetic condition, would then begin to lose that later on in life.
I see. The reason I ask is you said, was it like 85% seem to have intellectual disabilities or something like that?
Or at least other types of disabilities. So, many have intellectual disabilities, but there might be also something like, speech and language, orthopedic. And so there might be a combination of different types of.
And so, and I guess, and the reason I wondered if it was, because what I'm wondering is, it's probably, I'm just making an assumption here, but it seems like maybe the folks that have the congenital deafblindness, they might be more likely to have those, sort of multiple disabilities or whatnot, whereas someone who's acquired it, I mean, unless of course they acquired it in some sort of, ridiculous injury or sort of accident or something that caused, sort of physical trauma. I would think that, these folks maybe would be less likely to have an intellectual disability and then develop one, or like what. So maybe a better question is, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. So maybe a better question is what are sort of, I've heard of sort of, I can think of examples of sort of, folks acquiring blindness for sure. There's lots of, kind of obvious ones out there. I work as a first responder, and so I know like burns and, acid and, chemicals, that sort of thing. And, sunlight damage and, looking at eclipse, all that kind of fun stuff. And then hearing, you can think of just like loud noises or maybe a head injury or whatever. Are there common ways that folks kind of acquire deafblindness?
So you kind of alluded to this idea that when we think about it in relative terms, it's not that common, but there are some type of genetic conditions. So for example, Usher syndrome, which is a relatively common etiology of deafblindness. There are different types, but for example, an individual might be born with some hearing loss, but then they don't even know that it's Usher syndrome, which even though it's genetic, there's a genetic cause. They wouldn't lose, in many cases, depending on the type, would not begin to lose vision until they were in adolescence. And so that would be an instance where there might be some later onset.
I see. So some of these kind of genetic syndromes have a sort of almost like a delayed kind of regression of.
Yeah, it could be, yeah. And I hate to overgeneralize because there are like probably over 1,000 something identified etiologies of deafblindness. So it's something that actually is just not like we can say, pinpoint and say that, people that are with deafblindness are going to be similar, because in fact, again, even the etiologies are very, very heterogeneous.
Yeah, right. And with over 1,000, and it being such a low incidence sort of disability anyway, you could be in a classroom of, 30 kids with deafblindness, and they'd all have a different etiology potentially.
I know that actually I never heard of a classroom with 30.
No, I suppose not. But
I don't think that exists. But
yeah. Well, I worked. So the place that I was, and I don't know, I don't think they were all deafblind, but the place I was exposed to children who were deafblind was in a school for the deaf. And so, obviously all the kids were deaf already. And so that was sort of given, but only a few of them had the blindness as well.
Yes, very interesting point, because all of the different states have, because of the fact that, in the United States, every state has their own system, right? There's a lot of different approaches and ways that programs might look. So it differs very much from state to state. So like you said, in some states, there might be like schools for the deaf or schools for the blind, where you might see some kind of a concentration. And in other places, they might be dispersed throughout other types of neighborhood, district, that type of school.
And so you say there's these state deaf blindness programs all over the country. I never heard of them, and that's how I found you, was through the Nevada one. Are they all these state programs, are they all quite different from each other?
We are connected in kind of a network, in the sense that we have, like, it's like we have different project. We're all separate projects, but we all come together in like a community of practice, and we're connected to the National Center for Deafblindness. So these are grant funded by the Office of Special Education, Department of Special Office of Education, Department of Special Education, and they are designed as technical assistance projects. So what we intend to do is to build the knowledge and skills of people that work with individuals with deaf blindness. So we're not like direct service type of projects. We go in, we work with families, we work with teachers, we work with other agencies to build their skills so that they can be the ones to work with the individuals. So I had kind of like alluded to the fact that, that not a lot of people are familiar with working with individuals with deaf blindness. Many states don't have any kind of like license, credentialing, or anything else related to it. So teachers and other service providers, including behavior analysts, will maybe not have had any in their career, maybe one or two, and so because there's not programs or preparation programs specifically for the personnel, in many cases, these projects can be called in to give information and skill assistance with building skills in this particular area.
Got it. So most of your work isn't actually with kids who are deafblind.
It's for the service providers who, and we do home and school specific, child specific visits. So like more intensive type of TA plans that are designed to around the needs of those children in their programs and in their environments. But with the adults.
Just a quick tangent question that I was just sort of thinking about last night when we were going to do this interview. I'm curious. Deafblindness is obviously, in a lot of ways, quite different from just being deaf. I think most folks in sort of the deaf community communicate with sign language, and then there's various forms of sign language. But obviously, if you're deafblind, sign language maybe isn't as useful, at least not on the receiving end. And so I'm curious if there's any sort of the phrase is here. I'm curious how, if at all, how deafblind sort of kids, adults, whatever, fit into sort of those communities, like into like the deaf community, or into I don't even know if there's a blind community, but because I know I know just my wife was a sign language interpreter years ago, and and she's filled me in on a lot of sort of things about the deaf community. And then I had some opportunities to work with some deaf clients in the past, and got to learn a little more about the community in that way, and some deaf staff, which is really cool. And they're a real what's the term I'm looking for? I think they just have a strong sort of connection to anyone that is deaf, and they want to make sure that those folks feel supported and can be part of their community. But do you know if deafblind folks are part of the deaf community?
So some of them are, and so it's the communication characteristics, and also the different like groups that people might be connected with, deafblind people might be connected with, are very broad and diverse. I guess because the characteristics of the individuals are so diverse. One thing that I would say is that there are definitely some deafblind people who are connected with the deaf community, and typically they're called or thought of as like the deaf plus, meaning they have additional disabilities. in addition to being deaf.
Right.
So I would say that there are some individuals who are closely connected to that, and there are opportunities to be part of those groups. I think that because of the population of individuals who are so deafblind is so small that it's not like they have friend or social groups in many cases that get together or they wouldn't have the ability to do that in the. But I do think that there are some national level groups that do try to encourage people to at least be connected to each other and to resources. I would say that really the greatest similarity or connection among people who are deafblind is this focus on additional modes or methods of communication. So, of course, it's not just, like you said, just sign language, but there are a lot of tactile strategies.
Yes.
Because if you're not getting a lot of your information, or you're getting at least a reduced amount of information through, the typical pathways for learning, like our vision and our hearing, right? Our other senses that are available to interact with the environment is our sense of touch. So that includes things like tactile signing. So there are some individuals who use tactile sign, but it also includes like touch cues. It might include like haptic type of feedback. It might include object symbols and other types of tactile symbols and things like that.
Sorry, what was the one you said before? You said tactile signing, and then you said another one that I hadn't heard of before. And I forget what it was already. Can you just list those modes again that you just said? You said like 3 modes of communication, and one of them wasn't familiar to me.
Like I think maybe I said like haptic feedback.
That one, yeah.
Like
what is that? What is that?
So not necessarily like a full mode of communication, but a way of getting extra information from your environment. So if you think of things that like provide some kind of like vibratory feedback, things that can actually provide, that in that mode.
And what was the word you used? Haptic?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard that term before. Okay, gotcha. So what is it, because I imagine there are, there have always been lots of resources for, deaf folks and for those with hearing impairments. And there's always been lots and lots of resources for the blind. In Canada, we have the CNIB that's, they've been around for decades providing, resources for the blind. Why wouldn't folks just use the deaf resources and the blind resources? Why do they need you folks?
Well, that's a good question too, and they actually do use those resources. However, resources that are specialized for individuals who are deafblind are important because of the fact that it is not just a simple summative or additive issue. So, for example, you can't just say, they're deaf or they're blind. We're going to address these two things separately. It's really multiplicative. So if you think about like those are both of our primary senses for learning, there's an interaction between them that really limits how you get information about your environment when both of those when you have losses in both areas. So for example, I'm not getting information from auditory and visual information. I have to find a whole nother mode, and it's not just about getting the services from each unique one. And historically, the services for individuals who are deaf and those for individuals who are blind are not that necessarily that closely connected.
There is a lack of diversity when it comes to educational material depicting Black children in the field of applied behavior analysis. Human Expressions gives Black and brown children realistic and detailed images of kids who look like them, modeling everyday skills that may be difficult for them to communicate or express. At Human Expressions, the benefits of representation for Black and brown kids in educational curricula are clear. increase self-esteem, reducing stereotypes, and increase validation and support. To learn more, go to www.humanexpressions.org. That's human, HUEMAN, expressions.org. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is Nevada. Okay, and that makes sense. And that they would draw on both, but then sort of need, that kind of combined approach. Now, one thing when we talked was that it sounded like, kind of bringing the ABA piece into it, that there's not a lot of folks doing ABA with the deafblind population. Like, I think you had said that there's these technical assistance centers, all over the country, but that yours was the only one with behavior analysts. Was that I heard? Or
well, I'm not totally sure that that's the case, but it might be.
Right.
Yeah, there is not a big overlap between behavior analysis and deafblindness, at least not currently. So interestingly, in the past, there were actually more research that was done with some overlap. So there was quite a bit of work, some multiple studies anyway, that were done in applied behavior analysis that had participants with deafblindness. But that was in the 80s. And since it really has, the field has really changed in the sense that there was this greater focus on behavior analytic strategies and systematic instruction. And there were some publications in, journals related to behavior analysis. And there seems to be less now. There's actually a very low number of experimental studies and intervention type studies being published in the field of deafblindness at all. And not a lot of current research. Most of it has moved away from those behavior analytic practices. So I don't know why, but that is definitely a fact.
So what are then, and I know you can't speak to sort of every state organization, but what are most folks using, as far as treating, working with this population, if it's not ABA?
Yeah, good question. So I actually did a study that's going to come out, I don't know when, but in sometime soon. Yep. It's related to the practices of the projects. And so I actually wanted to know, this was based on a survey, and then it was, but it was also looking at what technical assistance providers, their perceived use of systematic response prompting and systematic instruction, but also if they weren't doing that, if they reported not doing that, what other practices were they using for instruction? So what we discovered was that there were, sorry, I don't have the percentages in front of me, but it was a relatively small percentage that were actually using that, or at least training other people to implement those procedures. And then of those people, we didn't stop there, because what we really wanted to know was, okay, if individuals were actually reporting using this type of instruction for transfer of stimulus control, then what could they actually answer questions about those strategies? And turns out only I think 3 people answered the questions about the procedures in a way that actually demonstrated that they would be able to implement those procedures correctly. And so, which is kind of troubling, right? So then my next question was, well, maybe they actually are using some other strategies. And what we found was that individuals in the deafblind network really have a lot of strengths in adapting materials to meet the unique needs and for strategies like tactile strategies, how to adapt materials to make them accessible in that way. and to change the environment. And there was a really heavy focus also on using naturalistic approaches. So they tried to really incorporate all of the environmental variables that were already existing. But what it came down to is what they described was taking a child-guided approach. And what it turns out child-guided approach meant on further questioning was thinking about communication, but rather than teaching communication in a systematic way, it was following the lead of the child and basically mimicking their actions so that they felt heard, which is clearly important, but also could take us forever. We're talking about somebody who needs direct and systematic instruction, because the only information they might be perceiving is that which we bring to them. So that was kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, no, for sure. So again, I think also, unless you've actually been exposed to sort of clients who are deafblind, again, you can have a lot of assumptions, and it seems like maybe all we have to be thinking about, it seems from the outside that maybe all we have to think about is, okay, they can't see, let's just get this tactile thing going, and Bob's your uncle. But there's often a lot of other things going on with these kids. So for example, I know one of the two children that I spent the most time with was a young fella who had Charge syndrome. And Charge syndrome is another. I mean, this is the other thing I think, is that there's these sort of congenital type syndromes that are also uber rare, and have their own sort of group. So there's a whole Charge syndrome association and so on and so forth. Are you working with those kinds of groups as well?
Yeah, actually we are. As you talked about Charge syndrome, for example, and they have, like you said, a whole network. It's actually one of the top etiologies of deafblindness, highest Charge syndrome. And so, yeah, like you said, they have their own group. The networks are connected, so they're very closely. There's a lot of collaboration with the Charge Syndrome Foundation.
And so with that in mind, like I know, and again, it's been a long time since I worked with that lad, but Charge is an acronym. And I know H is like heart defects, and there's a few different things in there. And I think one of the letters, is it R maybe, or one of the letters relates to sort of more kind of the behavioral or kind of potentially like intellectual disabilities, but a lot of the other ones are all medical stuff, things that for many parents are going to be probably a lot more of a priority. Like I know this one fella had like 20 odd heart surgeries before he was 2 years old or something like that. First question is, does your center kind of deal with all those other things? Or are you just there for the systematic instruction teaching part, or do you work with all the factors that sort of affect all these different etiologies?
So we work with all of the different factors, and so it's all individualized to to what the family or the team needs to support that child. And so we actually offer strategies across domains. So it might be instruction, but a lot of times it is self-determination skills, or sometimes people just want how do I access information. So it could be a really broad range of needs that people have.
And is there kind of this is not the happiest of questions, but is there kind of a general kind of, because I mean, if Charge syndrome is one of the most common ones, which is a rare thing in and of itself, again, with all these sort of life-threatening kind of medical things going on all the time, is there generally a fairly lower life expectancy of sort of deafblind folks, or?
There can be. It varies again according to etiology, of which there are thousands. And I said that that charge is one of the most common, but when I say common, I mean one of the most common, like nationwide,
Right.
meaning there might be a few in a state.
Right.
And, oftentimes it'll be like, it'll be an etiology that it's literally, they're the only one that I've ever heard of. I have to look them. I have to often have to look them up myself and research them. Like there's one of 8 people that have ever been diagnosed with, this particular, genetic syndrome or whatever. So yes, it can vary in the characteristics, including the medical characteristics, really, really broadly. Oftentimes, like you said, if there are complex healthcare needs, which is common, it can mean that somebody might be in and out of the hospital a lot.
Yeah.
So obviously that can affect instruction, but more importantly, quality of life and the focus of the family and the team. So obviously the health comes first. And so when you have a lot of health issues and that you're dealing with, families, of course, that becomes their first priority. And that stability and health wise is going to be the most important. So, a lot of times when there's a lot of complex needs, a family might not even know that they might hear, hearing and vision impairments might not even be diagnosed until later on because they are so focused on the immediate needs of their child.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely want to ask about that in a second. Because I guess what I'm thinking about too is, most behavior analysts that are listening probably work in, the autism world, and we know certainly from the autism world and probably from most worlds working with kids that early intervention is, going to always be more effective than later. But I would surmise, and just from what you've already just said, that there's probably a lot of these kids that don't get early intervention because their entire early intervention life is spent dealing with, the medical side of things, and maybe the actual vision and hearing stuff isn't even diagnosed. Like they might even, in fact, it might even be sort of assumed that maybe there's there's some autism in there. That's what's going on, and that's why this person isn't communicating and whatnot. So, what I guess first question might be, so teaching is different with these kids, right? Obviously. So what? Well, I guess first question is how are these kids assessed? I mean, I think the kids that have the acquired syndromes, it's more obvious because everything's fine or somewhat fine, and then things start to change. They're now not responding when they used to, or they're now not. They're now running into something when they didn't before, and so there's obvious signs of those things. But when you have these kids that are have a lot of these physical sort of, again, heart problems or other sort of major life-threatening things going on, and folks, and like you said, families might not even be looking at that. How does sort of I guess number one, how does sort of how and it's just maybe anecdotes, but what do you sort of hear about sort of how folks kind of are discovering that their kids are deafblind, and then what are the kind of assessments that are out there?
So assessment is obviously like this hugely broad topic. So when we talk about assessment, there's like so many different kinds of assessment. If we think about just assessment for learning skills, cognitive abilities, like for vision and hearing themselves, for communication. So all of those are basically assessed separately. And one of the interesting things is, from my viewpoint, is that a lot of kids with deafblindness are identified as having multiple disabilities, which is often not really disputable. But in most cases, what we think of as as multiple disabilities is intellectual disability, and then other things in combination with that. So what we, at least under the federal definition under IDEA. So what we're actually looking at is there are no norm reference tests that really include individuals that have been validated for individuals who are deafblind. So any of these tests that we do are going to be estimates. They don't have high validity with this population. So what that leads us to is is the need really for more, well, obviously we need more research in the area, but also more assessment in the individual areas. So one of the things that we typically look at is like for vision or like learning media, like what are the ways that this child is accessing information about the world? And then for like communication, it's oftentimes really important for individuals who are not like communicating in the conventional type of, vocal verbal type of way, to find modes of communication that can be, I guess, systematized to have to actually be like a language, right? And so there are some tools that are out there that were not necessarily developed from, if we think about like the typical tools that come out of behavior analysis, might have starting points, like baseline levels that are really beyond where many of these individuals are going to be beginning or access. So there are tools that can be used to kind of identify things like for pre-symbolic communicators, which is where we might be
starting. What do you mean by pre-symbolic?
So we typically think of like we have these like not in conventional verbal vocal language, but also not even through more concrete symbols like object symbols or line drawing symbols or photo symbols. So we think about, at the very earliest pre-symbolic level, these kind of communicative responses or behaviors that we end up being shaped into communicative responses, like the like crying of an infant, right? We have these kind of more respondent type of behaviors that then develop into communication over time as they're shaped. So we might be starting there. We might look at how things like touch cues. So how can we deliver some information about the world that is very concrete, like on that individual person? And so we think about the type of characteristics or variables that are related to the activity itself. Like what is going to tell me about if I'm going to have, for example, suction and for this medical procedure, like what is it about that procedure that the individual might be able to get information about? So we think about like the physical location on the body where it might occur, which would be, on the chest, and then, what it might actually feel like would be, a tapping sensation. So we can deliver information about it by giving a cue that is that cue on the body.
Yeah. And again, I think about this, the kid with charge, because he had a feeding tube as well. And I think that was a sort of a common thing as well because I think for him, it was like it was something that couldn't be taught. Like he was never going to learn to eat because he literally couldn't swallow because he didn't have the muscles to do it, or there was some sort of atrophy, or I'm not really sure what the physical characteristic was, but so you might use some of those touch cues to sort of let him know where the tube's going in, or let him know that he's got those sorts of things can happen. So as a touch cue, then. And we're going to kind of get into teaching here in a second here. I think this is the main thing a lot of folks want to know about. But is a touch cue different then from like a sort of like a physical prompt?
So yes. So when we think about like a physical prompt, we're giving an individual information about the behavior that we want them to perform, and this is not necessarily about that. This is about receptive communication, how we can help the individual to receptively get information about what's going to happen.
With prompting, if I'm touching your arm, it's generally because I want you to move your arm in a certain direction. Like a partial physical prompt might be, a tap on the elbow or something like that, or a full physical prompt might be me guiding your hand to sort of do some sort of behavior, like you said. Whereas a tactile cue, I'm not telling you to do something with your arm. I'm telling you that something's maybe going to happen to your arm, or I'm going to put something on your arm, or that sort of thing. Is that kind of how they would be different?
Yeah. So the first thing you described would be a response prompt, right? And then of course we have stimulus prompts, which also give information about another stimulus, but it's more like in the context, it's in a different context. So like when we talk about, like you said, a touch cue, it's for receptive communication.
Gotcha. So let's let's dive into that now, the sort of the teaching and kind of communication piece. I guess, so how do we teach these folks?
So I guess the most important thing that I think that people would agree on is that when we're talking about individuals who are deafblind, we have to really think about systematic and direct instruction. So we don't have a loss of incidental learning. So most of us are getting tons of information through our visual and auditory information, and it's mostly incidental learning. We're watching how people are interacting with the world. We're watching how other stimuli like interact with each other, and that's how we learn. But when we're not getting that information, and there's no way for us to access that information, we are people become really reliant on the tactile sensory system and the information that somebody brings directly to them. So in order to learn, I have to have direct engagement with the stimuli.
So can you give an example?
So for example, we think about let's see. Like I would typically learn a lot about communication just by how, or a young child would, just by watching their siblings interact with their parents, right? And they can engage in imitative behavior to copy some of the different sounds and the gestures and all of that. If I'm not getting any of that information, either any of the auditory information or visual information, I can't see that, I can't hear that. So how do I act on another individual to get change in my environment, right? If there's no way to see other people doing that. So what happens is that a teacher, a communication partner, whatever it is going to come directly to that individual, and then they have to have some kind of a shared experience, right? Which I'm not getting just by doing it alongside somebody else. We have to be physically engaged in the same activity, and I have to be able to physically sense that other people in a tactile manner are also engaged in that activity. So we're focusing together on something like it's joint tactile information rather than, if you think about it as like shared attention or joint attention visually, right? I don't have that information.
Wow. So it's pretty, I mean, it's a lot more intrusive in a way, I mean, or it can be perceived as intrusive. I mean, and again, I think this is again where biases come into play. I think if I were deafblind, it's possible that I would not mind if people are touching, because it's the only way I'm able to engage other humans, and so I'm wondering about sort of like how, things like consent and assent and that kind of thing kind of plays into this, because it's you're we always hear about sort of don't touch unless you don't have to, when it's sort of regular, not regular, but sort of more typical kind of systematic instruction, and certainly working with neurodiverse kids and whatnot, it's really encouraged to sort of not put your hands on people, as it were, unless you absolutely have to, or or maybe it's some sort of crisis intervention, sort of risk of injury or whatnot. How's that work with this population where you got to touch them all the time?
So there are different kinds of touch, and that's a great point, because it can absolutely still be intrusive. Like if you think of somebody and you can't even see anybody coming towards you, and somebody swoops in and like grabs your hands and manipulates you to do something, it can be very anxiety producing.
Absolutely.
So that's still a thing, but there are ways that you want to show somebody that, first of all, that you're approaching, right? So if you think about rather than just kind of swooping in, taking things away, touching them, but think about like a child on a bed or a chair. You can feel somebody approaching by if I touch near them, right? And as somebody that has some like residual hearing, you can also give cues and make sure that they have enough time to process that type of auditory information or visual information, whatever they might have, and then give them enough time to respond to that. So you don't just kind of come in and take over. Some other common suggestions in the field of deafblindness are, instead of like hand over hand, where we're basically just making somebody do something and I can't even see what I'm doing necessarily, but do something where it's a hand under hand. So people still have the ability to remove their assent when they're not interested in that activity or for whatever reason.
And this is something that's sort of, at least kind of from the, the sort of neurodiversity community, this is something that's recommended anyway with anyone, that, we shouldn't be doing hand over hand at any time, because like you said, it's just easier to sort of, say back off if it's underhand. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think too, it's really important to, like one of the things that's great, that I think that is really beneficial that comes out of the deafblind community is this idea of following the individual's lead in communication. And so it doesn't mean that we don't want to be systematic and that we don't want to help them to get to, to correct answers. But at the same time, we do want to be responsive and to acknowledge people's communicative intent. So for example, if somebody pulls away, right, then we would acknowledge that as withdrawal of assent. But also if try to let other people initiate. So once you introduce yourself and let somebody know that you're there, which probably is going to be through a touch, but it might be like a non-intrusive touch on the shoulder, right? Wait for them to show that they are interested in continuing that exchange. Like are looking for behaviors that might be more subtle in many cases, like a movement toward the individual, a change in respiration. It could be like movement of a body part that is, in a certain way. It could be orienting so that any residual, turning the head so any residual hearing would be, in the direction of the individual they're communicating with. Right. So subtle behaviors are often what we're looking for.
Wow. I think just having ADHD, I would struggle with this population because it requires so much focus and sort of attention to sort of these sort of subtle pieces there. I noticed that the cat tail in the picture. Folks won't be able to see on the recording, but I'm getting a little giggle on this cat head that keeps appearing. Yeah, I mean, is that something alone that you teach? You're teaching folks is just, observing in a different way, because observation, everything is so different with this group. So is that something you work with people on, is just changing how they observe things? Because I wouldn't think to look at breath or head turn or, the arm just moved a little bit and think that means anything.
So I do think that you have to, it is a unique skill to be able to look at those more subtle differences. But at the same time, I do think that behavior analysts might have strength in this, in the sense that they are trained to look for changes in behavior, right?
True.
And so we're looking at really differences. It's going to differ from one person, obviously to another, really, really widely. But at the same time, we can say that this is what is happening in a typical situation. Now, when we introduce a new stimuli, what changes? New stimuli or a new stimulus, what changes in the individual?
That definitely makes sense. So, because it seems like it's everything's kind of for behavior analysts that has no sort of sort of competency in this area. One might quickly be, stressed and overwhelmed by this population, because all the tools you're used to using wouldn't work the same way. So like doing a preference assessment, laying out things and letting them pick it, free operant or whatever, like what's sort of the sort of kind kind of case conceptualization look like, when you're kind of going through that?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So there are different modifications, and some things actually already exist. So sometimes you have to look outside of those more conventional tools and do a broader search of some of the literature. So, for example, there are some preference assessment methods and procedures that have been used with individuals who are more impacted, including those with deafblindness, and it might be rather than a more commonly used like paired choice or multiple stimulus type preference assessment. We might be looking at a single stimulus presented at a time and looking at something that is more engagement based. So we might think about it as far as present. Say we also might try to think about it from the perspective of the different sensory systems. So are there certain types of stimuli that the individual is more likely to respond to? And part of it just might be because if we think about like vision, something that relies on me using my vision, I might not find interesting at all if I'm not getting any visual feedback, right? So we might try to find stimuli that across all of our different sensory systems. It could be like, one could be swinging, right? We might have some that we use for vision, which would be like light up toys and things that move. We have some things that might make from sound that might have, auditory information, things that have vibratory feedback. So we might look at a range of different types of items that we might be assessing for preference and separate them that way. So we can look at, first of all, the types of stimuli that the individual responds to, and we can also look at duration of engagement with those different types of stimuli. And
so that makes a lot of sense. So I mean, present one thing at a time, number one, and certainly thinking about all those different kinds of methods of input, like the haptic thing I'm stuck on now. It's a great word, number one, but also it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot more things out there now, that probably weren't out 20 years ago that vibrate or that make different sorts of sort of sensory input that you wouldn't have been able to get in the past.
Right. Like we think of things as usually just like, the puzzle toy and the toys that we play with and we're touching, right? But in reality, we can think of if we think of like proprioceptive and our vestibulatory systems, right? Think about swinging, that's a stimulus too, right? That is completely doesn't require any vision or hearing. So,
and it almost makes me wonder if, some of these, things that are out there, and again, it goes back to sort of bias and assumption, that there's only one way to play with this thing, but for someone who's deafblind, they're going to have a whole different experience with this object that I'm going to have with this object. And there may be aspects of that object that are really reinforcing to them that I wouldn't care at all about. And so like the vibration, for example. Well, I mean, certainly I don't want to insinuate that some folks may very well hate the vibration too. Everyone's going to love vibration, but that these things have aspects of them that you wouldn't think would be all that exciting if you weren't deafblind, but if you are, they suddenly become just a whole different sort of interaction with the environment. You kind of find that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. The most important thing being too that we got to think about the individual and how they uniquely interact with the environment. But that's the part of the thing about the preference assessment, right? If we present lots of different types of stimuli, we can start to see if there are patterns in the type of stimuli that they respond to, like what systems are more developed, as well as what do they prefer. Like we can't prefer something. We're probably not going to prefer something that we're not actually accessing.
Right. And with teaching, is generally initially the focus on communication?
So communication is one of these most important, I think one of the most important skills, right? It's across all different domains and all different settings in our life.
Yes.
And obviously includes both these receptive and expressive. And if we still need to be able to engage and learn information, get information about our world, even if we're not doing it in this conventional type of way. So what does that look like? I think it's oftentimes one of the things that is most focused on in the deafblind community. Like, how can we tell people about what's going to happen to them, and how can we have a consistent way for people to know what that individual is communicating. So, for example, if we take an individual who is say we're looking at changes in behavior, like moving the leg or a grimace, right?
Yep.
So that's really hard to interpret for somebody who is not the typical communication partner. Like the parent or the regular teacher is going to be like, well, when she does that, when she shakes her leg, it means she wants you to rub her leg, right?
Yes.
Mom knows that, but does anybody else?
Right.
How do we turn that into a system? And one of the ways, the cool things that we can do is to make a communication dictionary.
Yes.
Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. Homehouse offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, Homehouse has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to homehouse.com/speak or search Homehouse on Google. The second secret word is tactile.
One of the things about having somebody who communicates with a pre-symbolic level, at a pre-symbolic level of communication, is that you have to find ways to make it systematic, so that any type of communication is consistent across communication partners, and it becomes more like a formal language rather than just a random behavior. And then that way we can actually use some of those behaviors that we can use behavioral analytic strategies such as shaping to do something like to shape a behavior like a leg movement into something that is more intentionally communicative.
Gotcha,
Document that is by using other communication partners will know what those behaviors, the communicative function of those behaviors.
Okay, so and that makes sense for like sort of, and that makes me think of the stuff you said earlier about sort of, being child-led or whatever. So if sort of that, if you can see that there are sort of some attempts on their part to communicate, then you can try to take those attempts and shape them into something that might be more useful across the board. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And so I think one of the things is that for behavior analysts in particular, can be really difficult to think of where to start. So we typically think, it's easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to start with line drawings, right?
Yes.
It's like, because they don't have conventional language, but that's not necessarily the appropriate type of system for everybody. So what do we do? Well, one thing is that there are some specific types of assessments we can do. For example, the communication matrix doesn't come from the behavioral analytic literature, but is behavior analytic in nature, in the sense that it uses principles of reinforcement to new and shape new behaviors, but also starts at like the pre-intentional behaviors is appropriate for individuals who are intentionally communicate, unconventional communication that's used intentionally, and then also conventional communication that is used intentionally, but is not yet symbolic. So that really is multiple levels of communication that all is before the most concrete symbol, what we think of as object type symbols even. So it can actually identify those types of communicative behaviors and then give specific examples of strategies and starting points at each of those levels. So it's a great tool in that sense.
So what actually is the communication matrix? Like, how does that work?
So it is actually an assessment. It is not a norm reference schema, but more of a observational type of assessment. And you can get it online. It's actually relatively inexpensive. But the great thing about it is that it does allow you a tool to have it started on like the cool.
Now you talked about kind of eventually getting to sort of the more kind of concrete sort of symbols, and so we hear a lot about tangible symbols. Well, maybe before we even get into tangible symbols, I was reading your I guess was it your dissertation, the evaluation of the system of
the study
prompts,
on
that one, or is that just a study? And I know you refer to the and you refer to the matrix in there, but you also refer to something that brought me back to grad school, and that was the Buchelman and Miranda symbol assessment. I don't know if I mentioned, but Pat Miranda's a prof at UBC, and where I did my undergrad, and so we got some bonus AAC classes with her that other programs probably didn't get, and so learned a little bit about this. But what does a symbol assessment look like, and kind of how do you do one of those?
So a symbol assessment is done to identify the level, the symbolic level of the individual currently, to find to help design, AAC communicator. And so when we think about, symbols, it can range from, abstract symbols like word or number, they're concrete, and we think of it as like line drawings, but there's a whole continuum from like an object symbol. There's multiple different types of object symbols too. Object pictures, actual objects, photos, which might include like photos of, and even within that, there's a continuum of abstractedness where we think about the most concrete photo being a photo of the actual item that an individual is using. Right, so black and white photo. It could be a photo of a similar object. It could be a photo of an object that the individual has never seen and then differs in some way, even though it's still a concrete photo of a different object that has the same function. So, and then of course, line drawings too can be very more concrete to more abstract. So this huge continuum of types of symbols. And what this does is provides a way to systematically assess the type of symbol that the individual currently understands to create a solution, and also plan for instruction that meets.
So what does that look like for someone that's, say, kind of more on the more kind of, I could see it like if you've got some partial hearing or some partial sight, how you might be able to, do a little more. But what's that look like on an individual who's, essentially got total vision and hearing loss? Like how do you even know? Like how do you know that they recognize the symbol? Like how do you figure that out?
Yeah. So one of the first things is that we want to look at functions. And so we would look at, does the individual have a way of responding? Did their behavior change in some way to show that they know what to do with an item? So first of all, I would choose the symbols that I'm going to assess from this list of items that they had functional use. I might say the individual understands what to do with the jacket, because when I get out the jacket and I rub the jacket on his arm, he puts out his arm to put his arm in the sleeve. It might be that when, I get out a cup and present the cup, that the individual opens his mouth or goes to reach for the cup or moves the cup to his mouth, something like that. The interesting thing is that when I keep saying I'm presenting the items to the individual, that's the kind of interesting part, because if we're not seeing it and we're not the item, how do we know it's being presented? And think about like the presenting it in a way so that they get some tactile information. So it actually, when I'm presenting symbols to a child, I might have an array of symbols or two symbols or one symbol, whatever it is, out on the tray in front of them, to the hand or to whatever part of their body it is that they use to select symbols or to explore things. If it's with their hands, I might actually move their hand to show them that that item's there and help them to first tactilely explore that item. So there is an initial tactile exploration before there's even any kind of there can be any kind of selection or acknowledgement of what that item is. So if there's more than one, you have to guide them through tactile exploration of more than one item. In some individuals, they might not even use their hands or their arms, but they might interact with the environment or explore depending on their skills and characteristics. And so it might be that I, touch it to their arm or their cheek or something. And I move on to the next day. So I would go ahead.
No, you don't finish.
I was going to say that, there are also ways of thinking. I wouldn't be presenting and asking, show me the, asking a question that would require some kind of a vocal response. I would be looking for, again, these changes in behavior, to motoric response and alternative response when that was what was needed. So not expecting everybody to just answer in the same way.
So you do your symbol assessment, you kind of determine that you're going to need maybe you decide that you determine that you need the object that is the same as the object. So, it's, you're teaching, I don't know, ice cream scoop, that you're going to use an ice cream scoop. Does your assessment tell you that they know that's an ice cream scoop, or does the assessment just tell you that, they can interact with the ice cream scoop, and then your next job is to teach them that that's an ice cream scoop? Do you know what I mean? Or is the idea with the assessment that they know that's an ice cream scoop, and then you teach them how to communicate that?
Yeah, exactly. So it means that they recognize that symbol, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it for communicative purposes yet. Really to have some kind of like idiosyncratic, for the skills to be more idiosyncratic. So like I might recognize, I had a particular child who recognized, for example, her cup, her spoon, as photo symbols, but then in other items that she didn't have as much experience with, she was at the object. Different types of symbols in some cases. I think if that's true too of, anybody who's learning language. I use, you have a very young child who might recognize, their name, but with other things, they actually they recognize, photos or other types of line drawings of, animals, for example, but they wouldn't recognize the abstract word cat written out as letters.
So then, now that you've figured out the symbol, how are you teaching? Is the teaching now more similar to kind of, standard kind of, functional communication training, or are there still some nuance to it all?
So I actually think that that's one of the ways that that behavior analysts are particularly well prepared to use systematic to use more systematic procedures to deliver instruction. Rather than just letting the child lead the process, because we also want to make sure that we're efficient, right? And being systematic about it helps us to, move along. One of the things I think is most different would be this idea that we need to make sure that the cues and the prompts that we're using in our instruction are accessible to the individual. So if I'm not getting that, we typically would give our instructions vocally, but we might also need to give different types of tactile cues. And I talked about, helping the child to see the materials and that were there in a tactile manner, but they might need to be taught how to do some tactile. We're using response prompts or tactile component rather than just our typical vocal instructions and cues. If the individual is not hearing that information, or also doesn't have more understanding of our abstract vocal language, then it's not accessible to them. So what is it that we can do? A response prompt might physical prompts, touches on different parts of the body. It could be actually guiding them either hand under hand, hand over hand to interact with an item. It could be to draw their attention to specific characteristics of an item that are relevant to it. So a cup from the perspective of somebody who is not seeing a cup, right? What is it about the cup that is, what is it that is, particularly relevant from their perspective? What characteristics of that item are relevant from their perspective? How do they interact with it?
Right. You mentioned, some folks might not even have sort of say that, the use of their hands or whatever, because again, often these folks with sort of complex needs have a lot of, other things going on, and, they could be, in a bed all the time, or, often, on feeding tubes and sort of different sorts of, kind of medical type, equipment and whatnot. I'm curious if both sort of for that example, maybe where they maybe can't use their hands and whatnot, or don't have as many sort of ways to kind of get that kind of tactile kind of interaction, but also just in general, I'm curious if there's kind of like either like assistive technology, or maybe or things like like wearable devices, like the watches and all those funky things that are out there now. Do any of those things kind of come into play with this work?
I would say that the majority of individuals would deafblindness have some kind of assistive technology, and of course, assistive technology is going to be across all of these, could be across all of these different domains, and so broad. So we think about, there's lots of different potential solutions, but I can't say that for sure that there'd be something that is going to be. It's not like that's always the case, but with this group, it's so heterogeneous.
Right.
I would say that we would typically be looking for things that incorporate more. There's a lot of individuals that are a more concrete level of communication, but not everybody.
Yeah, it's difficult. I know I keep asking questions that are maybe a little overgeneralizing, and I think I keep forgetting, and others will probably keep forgetting, that there's not that many of these folks, and like you said in the beginning, there's so many different sort of etiologies and so many different sort of presentations and whatnot, that to sort of say, does this work, is probably not a great question to ask, because it really is going to depend on that individual and sort of all those things.
Right. Well, it's one of the cool things is that everybody in the field acknowledges that there is, that it really encompasses, a huge range of characteristics. But one of the things that means is that, behavior analysts can have this, I think, I guess a potential role is their ability in single case research, because it fits this population so well, right? Just because of the fact that we're focusing on the individual and we have this highly heterogeneous group.
Yeah.
But, I wanted to go I feel like maybe it
Sure.
wasn't succinct enough, to actually give people like some potential tools to use. So we talked about preference assessment, but one of the things like an actual tool that could be used is a successive choice stimulus preference assessment. And there were some general procedures that were put forth by some authors, Logan and Gast. And that's a great resource, I think, to affected by their disability. And then as well as the communication matrix I had noted.
Right.
And then
Yes.
what it is like going back to some older research that I think could be really beneficial because it focuses on the environmental variables, which is for everybody, obviously, but for this particular group, and looking at ecological inventories and discrepancy analyses. So really, we get so stuck on what people have to learn all the time, right? Like, and looking at this this skill progression that we have predetermined, right? But using an ecological inventory and discrepancy analysis really allows us to look at the typical routines and activities of the individual interacting in those routines, and then teaching the specific skills that individual needs to participate in their everyday routines and activities.
Zigzag is an autism therapy management platform. At its core, Zigzag seamlessly allows management of programs, adding, editing, changing long-term and short-term objectives on the go. Zigzag makes data collection super easy for therapists on site and automatically calculates progress, providing you with session summaries and graphs in real time. Zigzag provides you the ability to manage all of your clients, whether they be center or home-based, and work with all the various therapists and parents seamlessly. Zigzag is based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and is fully compliant with both federal and provincial privacy requirements. Book a demo now at www.zigzagkid.com/product demo and get a free 30-day trial. The third secret word is usher.
Wondering just about outcomes. Trying to sort of not make assumptions here, but my brain just wants to make an assumption that this is going to be a lot more difficult. I mean, than maybe what some folks are used to when they're sort of working with kids that are deafblind. What are trying to see what the right word is, but like prognosis here, like, so and again, I know it's heterogeneous, everyone's different, sort of setting aside sort of all the medical things that are going on with these folks that might interfere either with learning or might interfere with living a long life. Have you seen sort of some kind of really positive kind of long-term kind of outcomes for these individuals? Do they tend to sort of for the most part remain dependent on others forever, or do some eventually become more independent? I'm just curious. I obviously you can't sort of speak to the whole group, but I guess for folks out there that are doing this work, obviously they got to have some hope that there's going to be some level of success and growth and change. So I'm curious to kind of what are some of sort of the potential positive outcomes to working with deafblind folks.
Well, I think we could take from it is that everybody can learn, and we're just looking at these smaller little pieces, right? And I think that the most important part is education and more independence in their everyday activities. So that's what I would say should be the biggest focus. Communication, I just think, is so foundational to everybody and to all of the different exchanges and interactions that we have with develop relationships.
Mm.
And to let people know what it is that you need to happen during your everyday activities. So I would say that communication and meaningful participation and increased independence in everyday activities are really key.
Mm.
And that can be improved outlination of the skills, unique skills that practitioners in the field of deafblindness have and behavior analysts have, can help us to really meet that, because it includes this more naturalistic focus on the individual and combines it with a more technological application of instruction, and really can make it individualized, but also efficient in direct instruction.
A couple more questions kind of before we wrap up. One I wanted to know was, so there's always, and it's important, there's always conversations in behavior analysis about, competency and scope and, those sorts of things. And really, having, mentorship and so on and so forth. Now, if, and like you said, there may be someone else out there, but for sake of this discussion, let's presume you and your supervisor are the only behavior analysts on the planet right now that are specialized in kind of this population. Where can folks kind of go to sort of, build their competence in this area, because it's such a niche area with such a low incidence population? I mean, it's got to be, yeah. What do they do? Where do they go?
If you're talking about behavior analysts that want more information on deafblindness, there are some resources available through the National Center for Deafblindness, but I would also really go back to some of those specific resources that I had mentioned, and ecological inventories, because that is existing literature that and publications,
right,
and tools that people have that particular group, but it's outside a little bit of the norm, or what we would typically have in our toolboxes as behavior analysts.
Yeah. Is there any opportunity, maybe in the future, or even now, for example, at your university, for being that you're specializing in this area, are there courses in this area? Have you kind of developed anything? Or are you looking at kind of develop anything to kind of, train, future practitioners to kind of work more in this area?
As a if you're interested just in deafblindness, there are states promoted just to deafblindness, but as far as tools and information for individuals who are behavior analysts, I would say that it is we do try to publish and also present on different topics that related to deafblindness. I do think that it's really important to expand behavior analysis to new areas, including this area, deafblindness, and so I try to that there is stuff that is out there, and there is stuff that has been done in the past. You just have to look a little deeper for it to find the relevant information. But of course, always willing to talk to people who are interested in applying different behavior analytic strategies and instructional methods to new populations. Absolutely.
That's awesome. And with that, you also mentioned that there isn't a lot of research out there. You've started to do some. I know you did a bit of a review of from other sort of disciplines and other publications, and then you've got your dissertation, which is that now published? Sorry, your dissertation. And I know when you sent it to me, it was a preprint or something, but
I had sent you one piece of my dissertation. Yeah. And so that was an article that will be out in I believe September, in Education and Training and Autism
Cool.
and Developmental Disabilities of this year.
Yeah, and well, that was going to be the next question: is are you what kind of projects are you working on right now that we might see down the funnel as time goes on?
So a replication of that original study that has with another participant who is deafblind related to communication and the system of voice prompts. Then there is, you'll see some other work that I have done related to database decision making. So those are things that are in the works.
Right on. Really neat. Well, Chevonne, really, really cool kind of niche area that you're in, and I'm hoping folks listening will either reach out to you or at least reach out to their local agencies to kind of learn more about this area, because I know there's folks out there. I often see folks asking about, what do I do? I've got someone that's deafblind. I have no idea where to even start, and I'm hoping this can provide a place from the start. And I'm just really glad that you're doing this work and that you're willing to come on the podcast, and we'll be following you to see what comes next.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much